Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to explore the incredibly versatile, high-stakes world of helicopter operations. We're going to fundamentally shift how you look at that simple painted H on the ground. You know, most people see that letter and just think, oh, that's it, a designated spot for a helicopter to land. But as we're about to see, the reality of rotary wing aviation is vastly more complex, dynamic, and honestly, a lot more fascinating than just a letter on the pavement. Think about it. A single aircraft can operate in vastly different worlds. You've got your standard helicopter, sure, but the environments it tackles, they're literally all over the map. We're talking sprawling airport heliports with dedicated control towers, tight urban hospital rooftops, pitching ships out at sea, and all the way out to untouched, rugged mountain ridges. It's the exact same machine, but the infrastructure, the rules, and the risks surrounding it completely transform depending on where those skids touch down.
So today, we're going to take a journey across these different landscapes. We'll start with highly controlled ground facilities and elevated rooftops. From there, we'll push out into the harsh realities of offshore oil rigs and moving vessels, before finally stripping away the infrastructure entirely to look at remote, unmarked terrain. Same aircraft, different challenges, different risks, and very different solutions. To operate safely, you truly have to know your environment inside and out.
Helipad versus heliport. Let's bust a common aviation myth right out of the gate. The terms helipad and heliport are actually not interchangeable at all. The crucial point here is understanding the scale and the scope of these two terms. A helipad is simply a designated landing area. It's a defined spot where a helicopter can land and take off, and frankly, that's about it. But a heliport? That represents a complete, fully regulated aviation facility. It is meticulously designed, equipped, and actively operated to support comprehensive helicopter operations.
The differences in the actual infrastructure are absolutely huge. A true heliport is purpose-built. It features passenger terminals, maintenance hangars, apron and taxi routes, active safety systems, and dedicated access roads. It is carefully managed and regulated. Now contrast that with a simple helipad. That might just be an informal or temporary marking out in a grassy field somewhere, with absolutely zero supporting infrastructure or services. So a great rule of thumb to remember: all helipads are landing areas, but definitely not all landing areas are heliports.
Section 2. The FATO and TLOF. Let's look beyond the letter H.
What's really interesting here is how aviation professionals actually define the physical landing space using specific ICAO terminology. That's the International Civil Aviation Organization. The first critical term to know is the TLOF. That stands for Touchdown and Liftoff Area. You might think the H itself is the ultimate target, but the painted H is really just a visual marking to help guide the pilot. That marking sits securely within the TLOF, which is the actual load-bearing defined area on which the helicopter is meant to physically touch down or lift off from. Now, surrounding that TLOF is the FATO, the Final Approach and Takeoff Area. This is a significantly larger, defined area over which the final phase of the approach maneuver to a hover or a landing is completed. And it's also where the takeoff maneuver begins. It essentially acts as this absolutely critical operational buffer space that completely encompasses the TLOF.
As you can clearly see, these zones nest together perfectly, almost like a target. The painted H sits inside the TLOF, and the TLOF itself is contained squarely within that larger FATO outline. But it doesn't even stop there. Surrounding the FATO is a clearly defined safety area to drastically reduce risk in the event of an undershoot or overshoot. You've also got designated, obstacle-free approach and departure paths, along with essential wind direction indicators, lighting, and fire and rescue access. Every single element is calculated based on the specific helicopter and the operation.
Section 3. Surface and Elevated Heliports.
Now that we understand the internal geometry, let's see how these spaces adapt when you go from ground level to sky-high rooftops. While both serve the exact same purpose, safely landing a helicopter, their environments dictate completely different engineering and logistical rules. A surface-level heliport generally enjoys way more space for sprawling infrastructure and easy vehicle access for fuel and services, but the second you start building up onto an elevated structure, you're contending with strict structural strength limitations, severely limited space, the absolute logistical nightmare of vertical access via stairs or lifts, and significantly higher exposure to wind and turbulence.
The contrast is pretty wild. A surface heliport sprawls out comfortably across the ground with dedicated hangars, passenger terminals, and simple perimeter fencing. But an elevated rooftop facility? That is an absolute masterclass in spatial efficiency and risk management. Your TLF and FATO are elevated on a reinforced structure. You suddenly have to account for edge protection, safety netting, structural load capacities, and the massive critical responsibility of preventing any third-party impacts to the busy city streets below.
Section 4. Offshore and shipboard landings.
Okay, so far we've dealt with solid ground and rigid buildings, but let's leave the land entirely. Out in the maritime environment, operations are separated into two distinct, highly regulated categories. First, we have a helideck, which sits on a fixed, stable offshore installation and usually has a slightly wider footprint. Then we have a shipboard landing area. This is situated on a moving vessel that is in constant motion, facing severely limited deck space, payload restrictions, and requiring immediate tie-down procedures the second you land.
Landing on a fixed rig means navigating around heavy industrial obstacles, cranes, derricks that dictate your approach path. But hey, at least the deck itself is stable. Conversely, a shipboard landing area introduces incredible maritime hazards. The pilot isn't just dealing with variable ocean winds. They are landing on a platform affected by pitch, roll, yaw, and heave. Throw in sea spray, constant motion, and dynamic weather conditions, and the margin for error is razor thin. Out here, you absolutely must know where you are landing and what specific international standards you're operating under.
Section 5. When there is no H.
So, what happens when a helicopter has to fly into the wild, miles away from permanent aviation infrastructure? In scenarios like remote mountain medevacs, rapid emergency responses, or temporary work sites, the sudden absence of an H means a dramatically higher reliance on professional discipline, pilot judgment, and strict environmental controls. You have to rapidly assess terrain slope, figure out wind direction without a standard windsock, manage the intense effects of rotor wash on loose dirt or ground personnel, and ensure clearance from temporary obstacles like trees, ambulances, or construction equipment.
Because you don't have those built-in facility safety buffers, flight crews and ground teams must rigorously follow a critical remote landing protocol. Step 1. Assess the terrain, wind, and visibility. Step 2. Plan safe approach and departure routes, making sure to consider escape contingencies. Step 3. Communicate clearly using landing signals and radio procedures with the ground crew. Step 4. Execute the landing with absolute respect for safety margins. And finally, Step 5. Continually review and adapt to changing conditions. Safe operations out here are defined by judgment, not paint.
Conclusion: look beyond the H. Let's bring all of these vastly different operating environments together to focus on our core takeaway. Safe operations begin long before the helicopter ever arrives in the area. That painted letter is literally just element number 1. Surrounding it is an invisible, meticulously planned web of systems. It involves the precise geometry of the TLF and FATO, safety operating areas, visual aids, and lighting. It demands strict obstacle management, coordinated people and procedures, robust emergency response plans, and careful integration with airspace, security, and the local community. It is a monumental task to pull all of this together.
Which leads us with a fascinating, fundamental question. If the paint is just a tiny part of the story, how do all these individual safety components, dimensions, and regulations actually fit together to create a fully functioning, safe aviation facility?
Well, we are going to decode exactly that complex system of people, places, procedures, and protection in our next explainer. We'll pull back the curtain and look at every single component that makes up a regulated facility in our upcoming explainer, Anatomy of a Heliport. Until then, keep looking beyond the H, and thank you for joining me on this journey.